Let's briefly talk about emotion regulation. And I say briefly because I know that I'm over time. So if you don't want to listen to this, you can probably skip this part. But it's interesting in that it shows us that we're not just slaves of our emotions. We have emotion-cognition interactions. We know that emotions influence cognitive processes. We know that memory is enhanced and attention is drawn when to particular aspects in the environment that have emotional meaning. But we can also have cognitive processes influence our emotions and our affective world. We can regulate our emotions. So if it's really inconvenient to have a certain feeling, we can push it aside and then maybe go ahead and experience it later. So these are two studies that show this. This is a study by Stefan Hamann, who looked at memory encoding of emotional stimuli. And what he's showing here is the amygdala, right here. And basically this blob here shows a correlation with how well subjects remembered IAPS pictures, which I'll show you just a few slides down. So they're pictures that are highly emotional in their content. So they show amputated limbs as a negative thing, well, to trigger negative emotion. They show couples hugging and those kinds of things, triggering positive and negative affect. And when these stimuli were emotional, subjects remembered them better. And this is what this is shown here. The correlation between how emotional something was to the subject and how well they remembered it after the experiment. Basically showing that memory is influenced by emotions. Now let's talk briefly about cognitive control. It's a process that allows information processing and behavior to vary adaptively from moment to moment, depending on current goals, rather than remaining rigid and inflexible. So we have cognitive control to allow us to inhibit some things that currently are just not working out for us, or that we just don't need. Behaviors that are inappropriate in a social setting, for instance, is something that we're pretty good at inhibiting. And this inhibition aspect is also falls under the umbrella term, namely executive function. So those are the things that our prefrontal cortex is mostly involved in. These things, or these cognitive processes, include attention, working memory, language comprehension, and emotion processing. When you look at cognitive control on neurosynth, you get the following network. Sorry, that was too fast. You get a network of regions that include the anterior cingulate, but the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in cognitive control, especially in inhibitory processes. So stopping something that you really want to do right now. Stopping a prepotent process. And this is highly related to emotion regulation. Let's consider what emotion regulation is. This is an anecdote from Gross. He is sort of the father of recent emotion regulation research. And here's what he's saying. He's saying that standing in a long line at the supermarket checkout counter probably isn't anyone's idea of a good time. But when the line's glacial pace is further slowed by a gossipy clerk, annoyance turns to anger, and changes become apparent in one's thoughts, feelings, behavior, and indeed throughout one's body. One's blood pressure rises, one's finger grips the card more tightly, and one prepares a scathing remark for the clerk. But at the last moment, the thought crosses one's mind that a cutting comment will make a bad situation worse. And so one opts to bite one's tongue and keep one's mouth shut as the dual decisions of credit or debit, paper or plastic, are made. It's neither paper nor plastic, but that's a different topic, obviously, related to sustainability. The point here is that we know that sometimes having an emotional outburst, especially when it comes to anger and expressing and fulfilling our anger in a way. It can be rewarding, but it's usually not the best option, because it leads to additional problems that we might have in the future. Another researcher is saying that emotional regulation refers broadly to implementation of a conscious or non-conscious goal to start, stop, or otherwise modulate the trajectory of an emotion. And in the previous example, that emotion was anger. And again, there's a motivation for this, because we know that everyone will be better off if we don't express our anger in many, many circumstances. That's not always true, but many times it is. So how do people manipulate or measure emotion regulation in experiments? There's basically two ways to do so. This is the ERQ, or the Emotion Regulation Questionnaire, which was developed by Gross, the quote that we just read. And he's basically splitting emotion regulation into two aspects. One he calls reappraisal, which is a cognitive process, and one he calls suppression. So let's read a couple of these, but let's color code them first. So reappraisal questions, or reappraisal cognitive processes, are the following. When I want to feel more positive emotion, such as joy or amusement, I change what I'm thinking about. When I want to feel less negative emotion, such as sadness or anger, I change what I'm thinking about. So we can actually refocus, pay attention to something else in our minds, and that reduces the emotions that we're feeling. We can even sort of rephrase a whole situation as being something positive rather than negative. There's an example of this in a second. Suppression, on the other hand, is I keep my emotions to myself. When I'm feeling positive emotions, I'm careful not to express them. I control my emotions by not expressing them. So basically, things that we continue feeling the emotion, but we just don't show it to others. And that's something that actually has been shown to be unhealthy by Gross. And that's basically what this is about here. So why distinguish between different types of emotions? Because they lead to different health outcomes in life and even additional aspects. So let's look at some consequences here. So these are correlations between the ERQ, split into either reappraisal and suppression, and other aspects, other emotional expressions or experiences in real life. So we can correlate this with the experience of positive emotion, and people that say that they reappraise rather than suppress have more of these. They have more positive mood, they have more discrete emotions that are positive, whereas this is a negative correlation with suppression, indicating that these people are experience more negative emotions in real life. And the same is true for negative emotions. People that tend to reappraise more show less negative emotions. People that suppress more show more or have more experiences of negative emotions in their daily lives, or report having these. Then in terms of interpersonal effects, the authors looked at how much positive and negative emotions are shared with others. People that reappraise actually just share in general more. And this is not a bad thing, even if you share negative emotions with others, because it's a way of repairing mood and finding solace with other people. People that suppress do not share emotions that as much. So there's negative correlations, right? These are all correlations. It's not causal here. Then a peer-rated close relationship with others is positively correlated with reappraisal and negatively with suppression. So they're actually quite significant effects of how we deal with our emotions. So if we suppress them on average, then that leads to negative social outcomes, negative emotional outcomes, and even mental health effects. So there are negative correlations between reappraisal and depression, and positive relationships with suppression. So you have more of that if you use, you're more likely to be depressed, or you rate your depression higher if you're higher on the suppression scale. and generally well-being is affected by these two types of different emotion regulation strategies. Let me skip this slide in the interest of time. This is basically the model that Gross proposes, such that there are different ways in a situation, an environment that you can select and modify, deploy attention to, and if none of these work, then you can still apply cognitive changes, and if this doesn't work, then you end up with suppression. So before you enter a situation that you know will cause negative affect, you have multiple ways of regulating this. It's interesting, but I leave this up to you to look at if you want to know more about this. What I want to show you here, excuse me, is how we can experimentally manipulate emotion regulation, how this is typically done in an experiment, especially in the context of an FMRI experiment. And then I will conclude with a meta-analysis again to show that these effects are consistent across studies. So in an experiment, typically what happens is people are facing either positive or negative pictures or events, and they're asked in one condition to regulate these and in the other condition to not regulate this. So a cognitive reappraisal instruction that an experimenter might give a participant or a subject is the following. It could be a film clip, it could be a picture. So please watch the following film clip carefully. This time, as you watch, try to think about the situation you see in a more positive light. You can achieve this in several different ways. For example, try to imagine advice that you could give to the characters in the film clip to make them feel better. This could be advice that would help them think about the positive bearing this event could have on their lives. Or think about the good things they might learn from this experience. Keep in mind that even though a situation may be painful in the moment, in the long run, it could make one's life better or have unexpected good outcomes. This is from a paper by Troy et al., published in Emotion 2010, and other papers, including FMRI papers, have used similar instructions. So when you're asked to regulate, and this is clearly a reappraisal instruction, right? This is not a suppression instruction. So this is the positive way. How can we think about a situation in a positive light? Even if it's currently bad, in the long run, obviously, this might be a good thing. And then participants are shown these kinds of videos and asked to watch them under either reappraisal or just purely attend to this and feel what you feel kind of instructions. And you can see that some of these are quite aversive. These are potentially scary, but they can trigger emotions. These are relatively neutral here. These are cutesy, so they're on the positive side. And these are obviously disgusting or negative. And that's showing relatively mild pictures here. Again, there are some really nasty ones that really do trigger emotions. Here's a study by Ochsner et al. Done in 2001. So it's quite an old study now, but it was important because it defined the field of emotion regulation research in neuroscience. So participants view either a film clip that triggers emotions, such as a crying baby, or a neutral scene, and then they're asked to, now attend or reappraise your emotions, and then at the end they're asked to rate how well they succeeded in reappraising the emotions. Just to give you more background on the FMRI conditions. So in FMRI, we have what's called like a relative science. There's no absolute zero when we look at brain activation. So we always have to have a good contrast. That means we typically perform a t-test looking at a treatment condition relative to a control condition. And this is a limitation of the bold signal, obviously, the signal that we measure of having no meaningful zero point. So this means that the interpretability of fMRI results is dependent on good experimental design. It can only be as good as your treatment and your control condition is. And what you want in the control condition is that everything happens, that the subject has the same cognitive and affective experiences except for that aspect that you want to manipulate. And now question is, did the current study accomplish this, right? So when we look at it again, is just having a neutral scene a good control condition? Does it have all the aspects that the reappraise condition has? Maybe not, right? Is the attent condition a good control condition for reappraise? Well, I would say it's better because it shows the same emotional response. It triggers the same emotional response, but it also enhances it, right? If we are tending to something, there's also an enhancement there. Well, that's exactly what they're finding here. When you attend to this negative picture, you see a very strong emotional response. This is somewhat reduced, almost to the level of when people or participants here are attending to neutral events, but not quite. So there's still an affective response, but this difference here is significant. So reappraising does lead to reduced emotion strength. And when participants are reappraising, we see again these regions that are part of the cognitive control network in lateral prefrontal cortex. This is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. You can see it here from a different condition. But we also see, so these are activated, so we see enhanced activation in the in the reappraise condition relative to the attent condition. Again, everything is relative, right? That's what we're showing here. But we also see increased activation. So the opposite. When they're attending relative to reappraising, we see amygdala, which we had seen before. And obviously that makes sense because it's involved in understanding and decoding negatively effective or effectively valenced pictures, right? So this indicates that, well, possibly this network here is suppressing the activity in the amygdala here, which would be an interesting finding. And now this is exactly what has been argued multiple times. This is now a meta-analysis done, I think, in 2012, which is based on 48 studies, showing that across these 48 studies, there's a consistent activation in these lateral prefrontal areas, also in the anterior cingulate here, and this is supplementary motor area, I believe, mostly in the left hemisphere, but it's consistent across these 48 studies. And this also agrees with what we've argued before, right? These are regions that are also part of this emotion-cognition interaction, but also cognitive reappraisal regions. So they're now here used to inhibit emotional responses. And what they're inhibiting seems to be they're suppressing the activity in this amygdala region here. So that the signals from the amygdala are no longer as strong, and the contribution to the current emotional state from the amygdala may no longer be as strong. That's exactly the hypothesis that's illustrated here. So activity here suppresses activity here, which is then basically the neural correlate of emotion regulation and leads to reduction of emotion intensity. Now, there are multiple studies that have confirmed this. This is a wonderful study by Wager et al., but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this right now. It basically shows that the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is correlated to reappraisal success on both sides, the left and the right. And then in a mediation analysis, it shows that the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala jointly with the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex are involved in reappraisal success. So there's a network that leads to more success if a stronger connection between ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and nucleus accumbens takes place. Higher success here. But if the interaction between ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and amygdala is stronger, then this leads to lower success of reappraisal. So they're following the instructions less well. We can also look at functional connectivity. That is, how are these regions connected with each other while people are performing reappraisal, while people are following these reappraisal instructions. And you see that there's a network involved, a wider network of regions that is involved beyond what has been reported previously when it comes to interactions. So the final take-home messages from the second part of the lecture on emotional regulation is basically that the brain has processes that allow it to regulate emotions. Emotions not only influence our percepts and cognitions, like shown in the first part of the lecture, but we can also regulate our emotions. So these interactions between emotional and cognitive processes are in fact bidirectional. So we have emotions influencing cognitive processes, enhancing memory for emotional events or enhanced attention for emotional stimuli. But we also have cognitive processes such as cognitive control and reappraisal that allow us to influence our emotional states. And we can do so well, not just automatically, but we can also make a conscious decision to regulate our emotions and to learn how to regulate our emotions when this is inconvenient or when it's inappropriate in a social context, let's say. And there's a clearly identified neural circuit that accomplishes this within the brain, and it consists of particularly ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but also involving the VMPFC. And these are recognized cognitive control regions that are important for keeping our behavior on track, basically to accomplish specific goals. So they're part of an executive network that allows us to, sort of more freely act, more freely plan behavior, and not just be the slave of pre-planned behaviors, interrupt certain behaviors that are ongoing, interrupt desires that we have, and then reorient even in the midst of an ongoing task. And one of the important things that I try to point out throughout this lecture is that all the methods that we use in neuroscience have specific limitations. This is true for FMRI, which is probably, it's actually the most commonly used method nowadays to peek into the brain. It is simply correlational. It has problems like reverse inference. So when we see a region activate, this does not mean that we know what this person is feeling or thinking, because this region, as I said many times, can dynamically interact with different cognitive networks or affective networks. And thereby it might actually give quite different information or add quite different pieces of computations to the ongoing processes. And when you read fMRI studies, I want to reiterate again that the types of contrast, especially the control contrast, the control condition, is very important for understanding and even being able to have any reasonable results within fMRI studies. So proper experimental planning is extremely important in the context of fMRI. So with this, I'd like to conclude. I look forward to your questions at the beginning of next week. If you have any other issues or questions in the meantime, you know how to reach me via Canvas. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to talking to you in person.